So, welcome to another episode of Anomalies. I'm Dan Hall, one of your hosts, and my other partner in crime, Dave Jinks, is ill and not being able to be with us. But I'm very excited about our guest tonight because, as some of you know who've listened to this program before, we're pretty big on the Mothman and what happened in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the 60s. And we've got a guest tonight, Brent Raynes, who actually wrote a book about John Keel and talked about the Mothman prophecies and a bunch of other things. And so he's here tonight to share with us some of his knowledge about John Keel and the interesting dude that he was. So, Brent, welcome. Welcome to our show.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. I appreciate you inviting me to your program. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, anytime. You're always welcome. So, probably the first question is, who's Brent Raynes? Tell us who you are. You wrote a book about John Keel, but we want to know who you are.
Well, I was born and raised up in the state of Maine. Of course, I currently live in South Central Tennessee in a town called Waynesboro. But I really got interested. I was, a young man, about 14, when I decided to become what I later realized a lot of people called being a ufologist. And I was living in Hollowell, which is right next to the capital of Maine, Augusta. And I was just really caught up in, the book by Frank Edwards called Flying Saucers Serious Business. There was a lot of sightings in 1966, and I followed it with some interest, but I didn't know if I really wanted to get involved. I was just a young man. When the major flap hit, all the reports the media was covering the sightings in the state of Michigan, the incident where Dr. Hynek uttered the word swamp gas that got such attention.
Yeah,
and not all of it
famous.
Good. Yeah, but we had some interesting sightings here in the state of Maine at the time. In March of that year, there was a John King, no relation to Stephen King, I don't think, but he was in an area of Bangor that was kind of an isolated area, and suddenly he saw this disc-shaped domed object, I think that was just maybe a foot off the ground, and he had a handgun, and he fired about 4 shots, and he claimed that he heard pings. Sounded like a metallic surface was struck, and he told the police about his encounter, and they told the news that he did seem genuinely upset and kind of traumatized by the experience. And so by January of 1967, at age 14, I decided to throw my hat in the ring and, just join those people who gather clippings and books and magazines. And I was, at the time, I thought it was simply either it's what the Air Force said, nothing to it, it's temperature inversion of Venus on the horizon, or it's weather balloons, or this and that. Or it's actually, maybe spaceships from another planet. And so I was on the extraterrestrial bandwagon in the beginning. And I soon was making contacts. I was writing people all over the United States. And by 2 years later, in 1969, I was actually on the board of directors of a magazine out of St. Petersburg, Florida, called Saucer Scoop. And Joan Whitnor was the editor and publisher, and Brad Steiger, as I recall, was actually the public relations guy, and Joan and Brad would write articles and books, and so this was all really exciting to be involved with these people. I was also a member of APRO, and Coral Lorenzen wrote me kind of reprimanding me for joining Saucer Scoop. It was like I was in fact, she told me I couldn't be a field investigator for APRO, but they would take my money though and use it.
Well, that's always a good strategy for an organization to have. They'll take your money.
Yeah. She just felt that they were substandard. That it was that me being involved with Saucer Group was and Brad Steiger was just they were more sensationalism and such that
Uh-huh.
in her view. So anyway, but I found that one of their writers that was you know contributing articles to that monthly magazine was John Keel, a journalist from New York, who I had read some of his articles in some of the newsstand magazines like Saga and Mail magazine, which anyway, my mom wasn't too happy about me buying that one, but anyway, uh, he uh, he wrote some very interesting alternative ideas. And of course, as we talked about earlier, brought up the word ultra terrestrial instead of extraterrestrial because he thought it was maybe a more of an Earth-based phenomenon. And so he always included with his articles an address in New York City. So I started writing him in October of 1969. And by that time, I had a little newsletter that I call Scientific Sauceritis Review, little mimeographed publication. And I had stories about MIB, the Men in Black, and so on. And he had his non-scheduled newsletter called Anomalies. So we'd exchange publications, and he wrote me some really great, interesting letters. Pointing, giving me his views on things, and even I wrote him in 1971 and asked him, I'm kind of interested in getting out of the field and kind of doing what you're doing. Can you give me some pointers? So he suggested studying up literature on apparitional phenomena, religious visions and apparitions and things. So I thought, wow, this sounds you know, like studying for college here. All this, medical and psychiatric and all this stuff that he suggested. Now, I did later on when I did actually venture out and travel through different states, interviewing people from Maine to Florida. Um, I was in touch with one of his friends who became certainly a good friend of mine, Dr. Berthold Schwartz, who was a psychiatrist who was also into parapsychology and UFOs. And places I would go, he guided me to different people that he had investigated and was in touch with, and different places like Ohio. In fact, the people in Ohio, Charles and Jerry Wilhelm of the Ohio UFO Investigators League at the time, invited me to use their home as a base of operations.
Hmm.
They had a place down the basement that I could crash, and so I developed a lot of really good contacts and helpful people, friends, and this allowed me to, instead of having to, drive back to Maine, I could just kind of use this halfway point between Maine and Florida, and that's in fact how I ended up in Tennessee. Was I met a young lady here who was helping me gathering clippings and had seen a UFO back around 1972, along with some other young people that were outside of the house that she lived in, just next door. And her and another girl were on the hood of this car, and they were just talking. And all of a sudden, my wife Joan looked up, and she saw a big round light object, whatever it was. She said it was bigger than the full moon.
Hmm.
And she says, I questioned you too much. You sure it was, as bigger than the full moon? That's pretty big, But she said as soon as she pointed up at it to alert the others, it suddenly stopped and went back up into the sky and disappeared.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting,
Yeah, very interesting.
Did you have any missing time? No, not that we were ever aware of, um, one of the girls that was with her on the hood there, she was telling me about it and wrote up a report, and she for some reason had a feeling it was from Jupiter.
Hmm.
I have no idea where that came from, but she did verify the sighting, and so anyway, that was, I met a lot of contactee experiences and people who had similar stories to what Keel had reported. That after a UFO close encounter, a lot of people report unusual cryptid events or psychic development in themselves, poltergeist activity erupting in their home, and of course, what happens is a lot of investigators from the mainstream ET nuts and bolts frame of reference, they tend to shy away from that if they, or they have in the past more so. I think in the present they would say, well, that belongs to psychic investigators, or that belongs to the people who investigate Bigfoot or something, or birdmen or whatever, cryptids. And so anyway, that's how it got started for me, was through John Keel. Because Jacques Vallée is another influence. Brad Steiger was certainly another influence. In fact, my very first book, Visitors from Hidden Realms, I got a 6-page introduction in the book by Brad Steiger, which, it's that book didn't really mention John Keel too much, but it was a lot about Native American and various other shamanic cultures and what they had to say about UFOs and legends and stories that they had. So I've covered a pretty wide range of things in my journey.
You've been down some rabbit holes that I've been down too, so I think we're kind of kindred spirits. Unlike many people, you actually knew John Keel, right? You
I
got to
knew
know him
him.
as a person.
I got to know him, and he got to know me, but we never met in person. I mean, I had been to New York City several times, but I was always doing something else, and I should have planned it out better because he wasn't in the phone book. So I'd get to the New York City, I'd look up John Keel in the phone book, and no listing, But if I had written to him in advance before I went there, but I did meet somebody who later attended a lot of his 14 meetings that he had for several years in New York City, Michael Lindner, who was investigating, psychic cases. And when I met him in 1972, I guess he had a contact case he was working on sharing with John Keel. And when I was in New York City one time, I went to the offices of Harry Bellel, who was a editor and publisher of a newsstand magazine on UFOs called UFO Update, and he also did one on psychic phenomena. And so I made his acquaintance, and a little later, I went ahead and wrote 2 articles for him, and after that, they went under. So yeah, that didn't work out too good. But I thought for a moment I found someone I could write a regular articles, or maybe even a column. But I got to know one of his staff writers, a columnist out in Texas, named Lee Walsh, who wrote a lot of features for the magazine. And she was an experiencer herself, had a lot of interesting experiences. And her daughters, she had 3 daughters, and the whole, they were all having unusual UFO and paranormal type events in their lives. So it was, one thing leads to another. It's all about
It
that
does.
networking and connecting the dots.
So one of the things I think I know, 2 things I think I know about John Keel was he never finished high school. Is that accurate?
He had like an honorary degree that was given to him in, I think, archaeology and herpetology, because he had studied a lot about reptiles, snakes, and in fact, people who knew him, and visited his apartment in New York City would find that he had cages of snakes, and he was really into that. That went back to his childhood. There was a neighbor that he helped with catching poisonous snakes, I think, and was a herpetologist type individual. He was interested in all sorts of things. But yeah, before when he was 17, he hitchhiked to New York City. Took him a couple days with 75 cents in his pocket, because he decided he wanted to become a writer, which of course did do, but that was something that was he had a little wagon, I think he was dragging behind him with some of his possessions. He told his mom, who watched him go down the driveway, that he was going to go to New York City and be a writer. And he had been a local writer in his own hometown in New York, where he was. But he in fact, it was called Scraping the Keel. He had a weekly column there, and it was mostly, I guess, local news and some humor and such. But he decided he really liked it, and so that's what he did. He went to New York City, Greenwich Village, and and he liked to write about fiction. He was a reading machine. He just constantly read a lot of things, and he wanted to, uh, become a writer himself. And he, you know, that was how it began for him. He became editor of a poetry magazine when he got to New York, and he also wrote different things for radios, advertising and such, I guess. So, and so
Did
he
he
became.
also did he also have an interest in magic? Seemed like I read something about that.
Oh yeah, he was quite the magician. In fact, they say that he had a book that he was working on, a manuscript about some of his own tricks and such in magic. He That's a whole nother aspect of John Keel. He was actually thinking at one time before he decided to become a writer of being a stage magician.
Mhm.
And there's some video on YouTube, some videos of him doing different magic tricks. And when he was overseas and going to different places from Egypt to Singapore, through the Himalayas and so on, he would often be in villages and be, kids would come up to him and he would, show him magic tricks. And sometimes the local citizens would, seeing that he did that sort of thing, would want him to do a little show for the whole town.
Mhm.
But he wrote a book, which I didn't read till later, called Jadoo,
Yeah,
which
I think
was,
I
yeah,
read that.
Jadoo meaning black magic, and Jadoo, Mysteries of the Orient, which I think was published in 57. He moved into that part of the world because 1951 he got drafted into the military, and
Yeah.
they sent him to Germany, and they realized this guy's done some writing, so they had him become involved in a radio program, military radio program, and they'd do shows over in Europe, there in Germany. And so he had a lot of things that he put his own personal touch. He did a little travel log type show, I think, telling about different trips that you could make in Europe, places interesting to go. He went and spent a night in, the main pyramid there in Giza, Egypt, a live broadcast from there. And then there was also in Germany the Frankenstein Castle,
Oh,
and he had someone, a fellow reporter, who went out with a live microphone telling what it was experiencing, standing outside at night in the castle. And then he had someone, creep up on him and surprise him.
which probably was a pretty big surprise.
Yeah, probably so, considering the spooky location and all.
So
But
let me ask you a question about magic. His interest in magic, do you think that in any way influenced the things he looked into, like at Point Pleasant or some of the other strange phenomena? Is there a connection there?
uh, no, I mean, he did. I think magic allowed him to, at times, be cautious about, aware of discerning things properly, being objective about what he observed. And in fact, there's for instance, I interviewed for my book on John Keel, which was published 2019. I've got the book right here,
Right.
John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. And on the cover, I have John Keel was a rich and complex character. And it's from Sandra Martin, who was a former literary agent for Keel. And she told me that his writings, she considered some of the best that she had read. She really, and they would meet just about every Thursday, unless she was busy. He would just come by her office in New York City, and there was a restaurant that they would go to.
Yeah.
On Thursdays, there would be a group of fellow magicians.
Oh,
And she said John would always introduce, this is my literary agent. And then, they would start discussing magic. And so one day, Ingo Swann was
right.
going to have some psychic that had Alex Enoch, who was a well-known parapsychologist in the area, was had sponsored from somewhere overseas, and so Keel and Sandra had been invited to attend this event, and they were given a front row seat right up front, and there was local press there, and so this is where Keel's magic came in handy, his abilities and his knowledge of it, because just as this guy put his hands out in front of him and this object between his hands, he started raising up and the object was raising up. And Keel tapped this Sandra Martin on the shoulder and said, "We've got to leave now."
Yeah.
And so he gets up and she goes with him and they get out on the sidewalk and she says, "John, now, what was that all about?" And he says, "There's a magic shop several blocks down. I can take you there. There's a trick that I can teach you in about 15 minutes." That was a trick. That wasn't a real psychic event. And it would hurt your reputation and mine if, some of the news people took our picture with us there.
Right.
It would look like we were endorsing this. So, and anyway, he later approached the parapsychologist and warned him about, you can't just, you got to be careful when you're dealing with psychics who claim they have these abilities, psychokinesis or levitation, because you have to have some knowledge of magic and really be cautious. So
Kind of interesting that he used his knowledge of magic to kind of debunk the paranormal things that Ingo Swann or other people who would have some psychokinetic psychic abilities. I think it's interesting that he used magic to debunk that.
well, when necessary, yeah, he just cautioned this Alex Emick, who brought the guy there, to try to be more discerning and maybe study up a little on some of the tricks of the trade. Um, uh, Doug Skinner who was Keel's close friend, and he was also in the entertainment industry and also a fellow 14, as Keel was, someone who was interested in the writings of Charles Fort. Keel was quite influenced by Charles Fort, his writings, because he dealt with a lot of unexplained phenomena.
Right.
And that was way back in the 1920s, early 30s. And so anyway,
Do you consider
quitting,
yourself to be a 14?
pardon?
Do you consider yourself to be a 14 researcher?
Oh, yeah, I consider myself, I guess, sort of in that area. I sometimes I don't know what I am, but I know that I'm
Yeah.
I know that I'm not just a strictly mainstream ET guy. I think, ET, UT, ultra terrestrial or extraterrestrial. All I know is it seems to be some sort of interactive intelligence. Keel felt that ufology was really a branch of parapsychology. He really preferred being identified as a 14 rather than a UFOologist or UFO buff, as he called it, because he thought a lot of them, he really insulted a lot of them as UFO buffs because that sort of indicated he didn't think they were really professional in their
Right.
trade.
Right.
And I remember listening to Jim Moseley talking with some others about how uh, Jim Moseley they had these big event. It might have been 1967. They had that huge convention in New York City that Jim Moseley had put together, the Congress of Scientific Ufologists, and they gave Keel this plaque. And he said instead of being happy and proud with it, Keel didn't seem happy at all. Seemed rather embarrassed or something that they gave him that honor. Anyway,
How did
the
John Keel find his way to Point Pleasant?
he was actually, he was writing newspaper columns about unusual events, and he happened to be in West Virginia, in another area of West Virginia, following up on a story that was several years old about a cat that someone had found that was born with the appendages that look kind of like wings.
I think I've
Although
heard that. Yeah.
I don't think the cat could really fly. But while he was there, he heard about this other story from Point Pleasant, in the TNT area north of Point Pleasant, the this ammunition storage place where these four young people were quite frightened when they said they saw this huge, 7-foot tall thing with wings that had these red eyes. And then it pursued their car at high speed, going back into Point Pleasant, where they went straight to the police station and reported their frightening experience there. And of course, it soon made international headlines. And then there were other people who came forward, and Keel visited. He visited Point Pleasant that year in '67 about 4 or 5 times, and he wasn't really the only one. He helped to put it on the map, but I've also been in touch, and it's in my book, with a Swedish UFO investigator named Aki Franzen, who came over from Sweden, spent several weeks in 1969, and then a few more weeks in 1970, meeting about 30 people who said they had seen Mothman, as well as meeting and becoming friends with Mary Heyer, who was the local reporter for the Athens Messenger.
Yeah.
Yes. And she had an office right there in Point Pleasant and witnessed a lot of things and helped Keel cover all these different stories, and would ride around with him, even sit on hilltops at night and watch for UFOs. And then there was also Dan Drazen, who was a documentary producer who was quite young, and at the time in 1969, 1969, 1967, he had a UFO sighting. He and a female friend of his, and he heard that John Keel was an investigator of UFOs, and he was going to do a local talk. So he went there, talked with him, and Keel invited him to come to West Virginia with him. So he made about 4 trips to Point Pleasant and area in 1967. And on his last trip, he even took someone from a PBS affiliate in New York City, and they were quite interested in using Dan to pay him to do a documentary on Mothman. And unfortunately, and he doesn't know why, but at the last minute, they pulled the plug. They didn't want to do it. But at the time, they seemed quite enthused. The guy that went with him was quite impressed, hearing the stories of the locals. And Dan Drazen, I've been in touch with him, and he said that these people were very impressive, that he interviewed. A lot of times he would talk to friends and relatives of the witnesses, and they would say that this person was not the same as they were before the encounter. Now they're like post-traumatic stress syndrome. They didn't smoke before. Now they smoke, they're smoking cigarettes. They're very, very nervous, and this really unhinged him, what happened. And while he was down there, he saw some unusual things as well. In fact, he described seeing this encounter that's described by Keel in his book, The Mothman Prophecies, where he and others, and he affirmed that he was one of those. One day, it was in the daytime, and they're seeing this UFO, and in their minds, there's no question. And there's one cloud in the sky, and this light goes up to it, and so they're sitting there waiting for it to come out the other side of this little cloud. And he says it came out, and then it was just making this plane engine noise, and said it was just a regular airplane, and they were all like startled by that, And he said he had seen some other unusual things in the sky too. But one of the most unusual things, which I included in my book on Keel, which Keel never did write about, He only talked to a very few people. He didn't even mention this to his friend Doug Skinner, who he'd known since 1990 and was very close to, and who would also join with him and in helping to do talks and things. But um, what happened was that on the night of December 15th, 1967, Keel had been told that something was going to happen, and he was led to understand that there was going to be a power blackout, and that when the president, for Christmas, lit the Christmas tree up there in New York City, an annual event, that there was going to be a blackout. So he and Dan were waiting in his apartment for that to happen. And instead, a report came over the television that there was a bridge that collapsed in the Ohio.
Like
And
Silver Bridge, right?
it was the Silver Bridge. 46 people died in that collapse of that bridge. And he had kept getting warnings from people, having psychic impressions and such. Even Mary Hyre, the reporter, envisioned that there was going to be some tragedy on the Ohio River, and there would be Christmas packages floating in the water and people
Uh,
screaming and shouting. And when Keel got a hold of her after the collapse, he got a hold of her, I think 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock the next morning, because the phone circuits were all very busy. She told him that it was horrible, that it was just like her dream, and there were other people. In fact, I was in I first went to Point Pleasant in May of 1976 and interviewed some people, and there was a woman there who had seen something very bizarre. It wasn't exactly the classic Mothman, but it was a cryptid, or whatever you want to call it, a strange apparition. There was a tall, dark figure out in the field that she said was moving across the field so fast that it was unhuman. She thought it was a robot later as she thought about it. Said it, she couldn't take her eyes off it, and she was trying to scream, but nothing came out.
wow.
And her ears were making a crackling sound.
Hmm.
And she said that she'd gone out of the house because she was going to cover up some motorcycles that were outside because it was fixing to rain. So whether this had anything to do with the electrical activity or something, but she said she was one of the people that had a dream about this, something on the Ohio River, and she told me that she had had other precognitive experiences during her lifetime, even dreamed of a jail fire in Point Pleasant once that took several lives. So anyway,
Oh,
what the big event, though, that as I was leading up to, was that that day that the Silver Bridge collapsed, John Keel had a visitor at his apartment, and this was a guy who worked in transit authority. I think sort of a security-oriented guy. Dan Dresden met him. He said he was a guy with a big hands, powerful handshake, and Keel thought nothing unusual. He hadn't seen the guy in a while. He was his best man at his wedding back in 1950. They were close friends. They had a lot of history together. Keel said it was his friend. Nothing unusual about that. But what really caused Keel later, he said, sleepless nights. He wrote to Dan Dresden. Dan Dresden sent me the letter that Keel wrote him. This was sometime later, a few years later. Keel wrote that he had met this guy's wife at Macy's, and that he said, "Hey, how you doing? I saw your husband a while back." And she says, "Did you know he died of a heart attack?"
yeah, no,
And
no, he didn't. Ever, yes, he did.
yeah, yeah, she said he died of a heart attack. Says, "Oh, when did that happen?" And she says, "Oh, in July of 1965." And Keel immediately said, "Well, I saw him in December of 1967." And she says, "No, no, that's no, 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 that's not possible." And he was like, Well, I saw him, and she's, insisted. Said he said she got kind of indignant because, she says, "John, I was there. Don't you think I know when this all happened?"
Yeah.
So he wrote Dan afterwards and said this was something that really bothered him, caused him to have sleepless nights. A lot of people would have considered that, I think, as uh, as a positive experience, but for Keel, dealing with the experiences he had, that he thought that the ultra terrestrials, beings, elementals, as the cultists would call it, that these were mischievous tricksters. They could mimic people. I know he had written me that. Um, but when I found this out, I was kind of surprised that Keel, out of all the wild stories he had published, he'd never published this one. He told Dan that he thought it would be anticlimactic to have included it. I guess it would have gone against the story he wanted to tell. And I know sometimes when he would write me letters, he would say, "Well, better not bring this up. The UFO buffs are already upset with me over too many things as it is."
Yeah.
But I talked to a couple of young men, Tim and John Frick of Maryland, who go to all of the Mothman festivals in Point Pleasant each September, and they were there in 2003 and met Keel, and they said they spent close to 8 hours with him,
Hmm.
and they talked a lot with him about different things, and he told them the story about a man that came to his apartment, and he had lunch with him, went to a Jim Moseley conference. It's the same guy that, you know, Keel had written Dan about. It didn't mention the name at the time, though, but it's the same story. And I think it was John says, "Wow, that's amazing. What do you think about the implications of that, or something to that effect?" And he said that John Keel said, "It gives me too much of a headache to even even think about it." And
Well,
it's
some of
like,
this paranormal stuff, if you do think about it, you get a headache. Let's go back to Point Pleasant for a bit. We did a couple shows on Mothman. Actually, we've got one coming up where there are two guys that are really into Mothman. They're going to be on talking with us. But a lot of things happened in Point Pleasant that didn't really have to do anything with Mothman. There were UFO kinds of things. There were men in black, uh, Indrid Cold, if that name means anything to you. So what the heck do you think was going on in Point Pleasant?
well, I don't know. I just know that there are, a lot of elements that are similar to a lot of other cases. It was certainly a very concentrated activity that was going on there. I talked to Rosemary Guiley when I was there back in 2015, and she said that whole area had, you know, had all kinds of paranormal UFO activity for years and years. And but she felt that there was something very particularly active about that area there.
What
And
what it, what intrigues me a little bit is you're probably familiar with the Skinwalker Ranch.
mhm.
So I think that there are these weird places, and Point Pleasant comes to mind where you get like a Disneyland of paranormal kinds of activities. And that's very intriguing to me as to what causes that. Some people would say it's environmental, some people would say it's caused by hallucinations. I don't know. Do you want to speculate on any of that?
Well, I know that Anne Rosemary Guiley had expressed to me that she thought that it might have had something to do too with the TNT area, the World War II ammunition
Chemicals and
uh, plant, the chemicals that were seeping into the soil. The
yeah.
EPA had come in, and that this might have created sort of a very negative environment. And she kind of thought maybe that the Mothman might have been kind of like a Jinn type entity, which could be pretty dark, I guess.
Yeah.
And so she definitely, she said that whenever she could, she liked going to that area and investigating and meeting the people and finding out the latest information. Of course, after the collapse of the Silver Bridge, the activity died down a lot, but there's still people reporting uh, unusual phenomena. I've met a couple who are often at the festival there in September's. It's Joy and Tanya Medea, and they went to, actually it was his wife's interest, and they're both involved. They've been investigating haunted houses and such for a number of years, and they both have some psychic ability. In fact, she's rather mediumistic, and he wasn't really all that excited about going to Point Pleasant in the beginning. It's quite different now, of course. He's quite interested in Keel and the Mothman and all of that, and no doubt because when they went themselves, they went, I think, first to Point Pleasant, then they traveled up 62 to visit the T&T area, and they wanted to check out some of the igloos, and they got kind of a negative feeling like something was watching them, so they decided to head back to town. And as they're going down 62, all of a sudden there was this kind of tall, dark figure that just seemed to leap across the road in front of them. And later they both each drew a picture of what they had seen. If the other one, they said if the other one hadn't seen it, they probably would have just kind of dismissed it, but they both saw the same thing. And they later realized that they were missing some time. And also, it was the fact that there was a gas station there with all these flags, colored flags that, from one end, and it was like a rope going up over it and down to the other side. And along with that wasn't there when they went back. And also, there was a cornfield that wasn't there. There was a building, I think, where this cornfield had been. So, I mean, not only did they have some missing time they couldn't account for, but also the place was different than what they remembered. But all they knew was they had traveled down 62 to go back into Point Pleasant, and they were a little delayed. But then all when they went back with some investigators later, there were things that were different than what they remembered. So
So one of the fascinating aspects of the Mothman phenomena is the being referred to as Indrid Cold. Are you familiar with that character in the Mothman story?
oh yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Who the hell was that?
I don't know. I don't know. I know there's been quite a bit written and said about it, and of course that came through Woodrow Derenberger.
Nuremberg.
Yeah, his encounter with the smiling,
Grinning man.
Indrid Cole. Yeah, coming up to his car after a UFO had landed in the road, I think blocked his passage. He was coming back from a place in Ohio, Marietta, Ohio, returning home. This was around the same time as the whole Mothman thing had broke out, and apparently there was some UFO activity, I think, around his home that people were observing around about that time too, and so Keel and Gray Barker, they were all went together, I think, to interview Woodrow Derenberger and get his account of Cole, and supposedly he kept coming back to visit Derenberger. And of course, the story only gets wilder and wilder from there. I've done a brief interview for my magazine with his
Daughter.
daughter.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she remembers. She says the event that local press and the police came to his house soon afterwards, including the men in black, according to her story. And then later, meeting Cole and some of his family came and visited. So I don't know who they were,
Yeah.
you know.
Or what they
Yeah, and she
were,
told
I
me,
guess.
I don't know. And also, she said years later she got a nice phone call from John Keel, just kind of, checking to see how she was doing and kind of reminiscing about the old days, I guess.
Hmm. So let's go back to the idea of extraterrestrials versus ultra terrestrials. So how would you distinguish between those two terms as far as Keel was looking at things?
Well, I've kind of been saying recently that, to me, whether they're ultra terrestrial or extraterrestrial, um, I'm not really concerned with it. It's just it's some sort of interactive uh, intelligence. It is capable of a lot of unusual psychic effects. A lot of people report telepathic communication they have for quite a number of years. And they can appear and disappear. They can go through solid walls. They can even take you through the solid walls if those accounts are not necessarily just true, but maybe if the person's in an altered state, we don't know how that may affect their perceptions. But um, there, Keel wrote in one of his first books on the subject that came out in 1970, Strange Creatures from Time and Space, that ghosts, aliens, UFOs, what was the difference? They can do all these ghost type things. They can go through solid matter. They can, do all the things that a ghost can do, the aliens. But in quantum physics, they talk about non-local reality. Um, I mean, you could be dealing with a Earth-based intelligence, or it could have been extraterrestrial, and then it decided to set up bases here. Maybe under our ocean. Ivan Sanderson speculated a lot about that fact, or that speculation, I should say. Or they could be they could be both. It's just hard to tell. But I don't really have any for sure answers. I do think that one of the things that kind of influenced me a lot, and I know we were probably going to talk about this later, but was uh, I met a guy that I later found out was not only a ghost hunter, but he was also a alien abductee, and
Yeah.
he saw his first alien about age 5, his first ghost at about age 5, and still having these experiences, including alien abduction. And his name is Brett Oldham, and I met him back in early in 2010, and we were working and doing some paranormal investigation, visiting haunted sites. I was introduced to him really by a Sandy Nichols, who also said he was an alien abductee and has a group called ARG, Alien Research Group, out of close to Nashville. And so, got introduced to this idea of the ghost box. The has the radio sweep
Right.
goes on continuous scan, and you have to fix it that way. You can get a Radio Shack. You could pick up a AM/FM digital radio, and as you know, fix it up. And besides picking up these clips from radio stations, um, supposedly it's the white noise that they can come through, and you get things, unusual things. And I got working with Brett. A voice saying it was John Keel. We got that a number of times,
Really?
and so I actually Dan Drazen, who was Keel's friend, as I mentioned, went to West Virginia back in the early days and was a documentary producer. A few years ago, he traveled around the world and he did a documentary called Calling Earth. And it's about EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, and other instrumented communications, maybe visual images coming through a TV of a person who was passed on. And so he's become involved in that. And so I sent him some audio I had. And one he said that really impressed him, which I sent you a clip earlier today, was where right here in my own home, I had one of these instruments and came through the radio and I got it recorded and it said, John Keel, Brent, Bert here. And Bert was actually the psychiatrist I mentioned, Bert Schwartz. I always called him Bert. Friends called him Bert, or Berthold Schwartz was the more, when he published an article or something was published about him, it was usually Berthold Eric Schwartz. But he became, because of actually Keel, he became quite interested in all this stuff. Before that, he was just into parapsychology and psychiatry. And he published a thing in a medical journal about 4 people he had interviewed. This was back in 1968 about seeing UFOs. And anyway, the Paul Harvey, the famous news broadcaster, got a hold of the story and put it on the air. And then later did another show with, wanted to do an interview with Bert and on his UFO, his thoughts on UFOs. And this is how John Keel discovered him. And then John Keel notified the people in England who ran the Flying Saucer Review, Charles Bowen, and somebody else, I forget. But anyway, that was how Dr. Schwartz, Bert Schwartz, entered the UFO field. And I discovered and started corresponding with him in 1973. And we had about 37 years of correspondence. And he was very, very helpful. I've got several different folders of correspondence that I had with him. He passed away in September of 2010, the year I first started using the Ghost Box. And actually, soon after he passed, I was getting what sounded like, Dr. Schwartz. And then I got that one there with John Keel, Brent, Bert here, and I thought, wow. And that quick little section of audio, there was three identities I could recognize: John Keel, and my name, and then of course Bert. It was pretty much a Class A recording, and
right?
that
Because a lot of those recordings are not. I've done EVP work, and a lot of those. Some people would say, if you're familiar with the term pareidolia, where the mind organizes sounds into things that might not really be there.
Well, right, is now, like I say, Dan Dresden, I sent this audio to him, and he said that one impressed him a lot. He said it was outstanding. He says he usually shies away from the Ghost Box, right, because pareidolia can, with all the other noises that come through it. But he said that was so unusual and so clear that, and some of the others, but that was the one that impressed him the most out of about 10 that I had sent him. And I've,
I was going to say, let me go back to a couple more things with John, and then I kind of want to get your views of what all this stuff means. Seems to me that John Keel used the term super spectrum. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate. Yes.
So what is that? What was he talking about?
Well, there's the electromagnetic spectrum, and then he felt that these entities, these beings, were able to manipulate it in ways that is still really not well understood by us. It's something that is there's more advanced levels, I think, maybe to it than our science fully comprehends yet. Maybe it lapses over into quantum physics. In fact, he told his friend Doug Skinner that he actually tried to introduce to the field a kind of simplified version of quantum physics that the average layman could kind of understand. And he used the electromagnetic spectrum, and he introduced a term, the superspectrum, to kind of apply to it. But I know that there's researchers who are following up on those ideas, and they're looking at plasma energy, and maybe that some of these are plasma beings, kind of like some people think that the Muslim jinn were of smokeless fire, that they were maybe perhaps actual beings that are kind of like composed of plasma energy, whereas we're carbon based, they're like maybe plasma based. And my friend Greg Little and a British researcher Andrew Collins have explored this idea of plasma beings, or plasmoids, as some call them. There are some scientists who think that they're actually there could be an intelligence of beings, that sometimes that the plasma itself seems to possess certain characteristics of a living life form, and it could be possible that we could be dealing with intelligences from elsewhere that are plasma based. So, and we have some reports of UFOs and even ball lightning that seem to have intelligence, and they look kind of like plasma energy forms. And so that's another area to consider. And it was really, I think they were just like myself, influenced by, and the things that we looked at, by John Keel. I think John Keel had also influenced them to look at the electromagnetic spectrum closer. Because if it hadn't been for John Keel, I don't know that I would have taken the journey that I have and explored the different areas that I have in all of this, the psychic elements and so on, and the reports of cryptids, and considered the idea of apparitions.
Sounds like he was very influential in your life.
So yeah, he was influential with a lot of people, and a lot of areas of and for a while there, it looked like he was going to kind of die out in the memory of people in the field. He actually went on to Coast, and
I think I heard that interview with him.
yeah, from what I remember, he was on, and he was asked by Art Bell. I guess because the Mothman Prophecies, the movie, had come out, and that was how he came on Art Bell's radar. And he says, "How is it that I didn't know about you, Mr. Keel?"
Right.
Or something like that, But now I think we're back to recognizing the name. I interviewed a well-known researcher who had been in the field since, I think, 1959. Had started out with NICAP and National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, a well-known organization back in the 50s and 60s. And she had investigated, written about psychic phenomena. She wrote a book with D. Scott Rogo, a well-known parapsychologist, about several abductions in California. And yet, when I was talking with her, interviewed her a few years back, she didn't recognize the name John Keel. And I thought, oh, how can this be possible? You're
Right.
involved in all the same areas that he was. She even entertained the idea of the jinn. And so, and various other entities reported by Native Americans and so on. And so she was really, I think somewhere in the past, she had to have come across his writings. She just, at that moment that I was interviewing her, she just didn't, her brain just didn't bring it up, surely, because
I think that's one of the reasons I was really anxious to have you on not anxious, that's not the right word, excited to have you on our program because I think John Keel should be very influential about a whole lot of things, not just the Mothman story, but uh, this idea of the super spectrum. I have a dog, used to have a dog, she's passed now, Claire, and I used to live on a lake in a cabin, and I would notice that Claire was always looking up in the rafters, and we seemed to be looking at something. And every once in a while we park, and I think she's seeing something that I, as a human being, am not able to see. And I think that ties into this super spectrum kind of a concept. So that made a lot of sense to me. And the idea that there could be entities, beings, whatever you want to call them, coexisting in your environment, and you just can't see them because you can't see X-rays or gamma rays or whatever. That's that's almost both exciting and unnerving at the same time.
Yeah, and there are scientists that seem to be looking for explanations as to why some people seem more receptive. We know that animals
Right.
can see and hear things that we can't, as you pointed out, but also maybe certain people, um, like you know Christopher Kit Green was a medical doctor, very skilled PhD, MD, worked for the CIA, and Richard Helms, associate, in 1972 in December of that year he appointed Christopher Kit Green to being the person who was supposed to be the eyes and ears of the CIA about what was going on at the Stanford Research Institute with Uri Geller and Ingo Swann, all these psychics doing the remote viewing and psychokinesis. And I've gathered he was quite skeptical in the beginning, but now he's still involved and working with a scientist from Stanford named Gary Nolan, who I've had a little bit of limited contact with. And they're all working with Jacques Vallée,
Mhm.
and it's they're doing MRIs of people who have been experiences
Ah,
and finding that the caudate putamen area they call it, which I didn't even know existed, in the brain has more like wiring it seems with experiences than it does with non-experiences.
wow.
Um, and I've learned from Kathy Martin, who's a well-known UFO researcher,
Yeah, she's been on
former
our program. Yeah.
yeah, she gets around. I found out from her about this how people who enter altered states like hypnosis or meditation a lot have a larger corpus callosum
Mm,
between their two brain hemispheres, and supposedly Albert Einstein and even the famous psychic Edgar Casey had uh, had larger corpus callosums. And so I figured that anyone who's been involved with, as an experiencer, altered states are often a part of it. They have missing time. They have all these maybe trauma, traumatic stress disorder as a result, or there's the psychic factor that enters the picture. And I figure that there indeed may be different parts of the brain that would show up in, MRIs and an analysis of brain structures. So um, I just find that interesting, and maybe their proneness to the experiences uh, that maybe there's sometimes it seems to follow generations. You meet some people who claim that they've had these experiences, and
their
their
parents
mother
had
and
them
their
too.
grandmother. Yeah, it just goes right down to the family line.
So,
Um,
just to give you an idea of some of the things I'm into. So I used to be a MUFON member, and I was a member of their experiencers research team. And some of the same stuff you were talking about came out that people who had, for lack of a better term, I don't want to say alien abductions, but experiences with non-human intelligence, they developed actually different skills after those encounters. And now I'm associated with Opus. Are you familiar with Opus? Organization for Paranormal Understanding and Support.
no, no,
You might want to have a
I'm not.
conversation with Les Velez, who's the kind of the organizer of that group, because what we're doing is we're talking to people who just have some incredibly weird experiences, and they don't have anybody to talk to because people think they're crazy. It's too far fetched for some of them. So there is an attempt to kind of get past the stigma of not being able to talk about unusual experiences.
Hmm. Well, after the show, if you wouldn't mind maybe sending me an email with their information, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll do that. Um, so I want to be conscientious about our time here. You've got probably other things to do besides talk to me. So I kind of want to end up with this topic and whatever else you want to talk about to, to end our conversation, which, by the way, I've really appreciated. I've enjoyed this. So as
Oh, no problem. I appreciate it.
as somebody who started out being interested in ufology and who's kind of come to the conclusion, which I have, seems kind of weird to separate out the cryptid. When I go to a paranormal conference, I see the cryptid people in one section, the UFO people in another section, and the ghost people in a third section, and they don't want to have anything to do with each other because they think that's all crazy. I don't think it is. And I think that's what John Keel was kind of getting at. So one question I have for you is what is reality all about? Well, what are your conclusions about what is real and what is it, and how we find out the answer to that?
Hmm. Well, it seems like there was a Jacques Vallée quote I saw recently that uh, we're familiar with a lot of fields that we can get into. We can become a dentist. We go to school to become a dentist. We learn all about that trade, or you become an electrician. But ufology was one of those areas that you never really get to be an expert in. you know, there's always too much unknownness to it to really be able to say you really have a full understanding. So I don't claim to have, other than just that I feel it's a real thought provoking, challenging, and serious area of inquiry. I think that there are there is an interactive intelligence. Where exactly it comes from, sometimes it's kind of trickster like. It doesn't really uh, reveal its true identity. Sometimes it can tell us things, as it did with Keel, in advance that something's going to happen, and people have precognitive experiences, and it seems to introduce various areas. I mean, Greg Little was explaining to me, like with the Native American trickster, that the shamans realized, or the medicine people realized, that they had to work with it. It could tell them valuable things. It could tell them about the future, but it could also
Deceive them.
at times lie to them, deceive them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they, in order to they had to try to maintain a balance in their communications, be discerning. And I think that with the UFO thing, a lot of the contactees earnestly tell you, hey, they told me they were from here and all this. And there's so many scenarios to this. I don't think I don't think that there's that many places that they're really from. I think that this is all primarily one in primarily one group that's orchestrating the whole thing. Pretty much. Not that there aren't extraterrestrials, but there's something I think that's more um, Earth-based and has tremendous psychic ability and maybe technology that is currently beyond our full understanding. And it kind of, you know, maybe it's like wild speculation. Maybe it's like Star Trek, the non-interference directive. They don't really
Right.
want us to
Prime
know who
directive.
they are.
Right.
That sounds better than that they're doing it, uh,
Or bad
with any
motives.
kind of evil intent or,
Yeah.
or anything like that.
Hmm.
But I definitely think that it's a worthwhile area of study, and I'm glad to see I've worked with various people who are academic PhDs. I worked with the free organization, the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Extraordinary Experiences. That's a lot of E's there. And the CCRI, Contact Research Institute, Contact and Consciousness Contact Research Institute, CCRI. It's the same people. They did a 5-year study, produced Beyond UFOs, which I contributed about a 50-page chapter on a lot of historical things from different fields, like the Marian apparitions, the Virgin Mary apparition, going back to the Dance of the Sun in Fatima, Portugal in 1917, and other such events, and pointing out the psychic interconnections to a lot of this and the similarities to UFO encounters and contacts. And I've written in volume, they've got 4 volumes coming out now on all this. That's each one's about 800 pages, and I'm in volume 2. I've written about John Keel there. I've become sort of the John Keel guy here, but
You should be. You know enough about him. You should be thought of as an expert.
well, writing the book and also interviewing people who had also known him and been influenced by his work helped me a lot to be able to do these interviews. I wish that I had known I was going to do a book like this. I would have asked John Keel more questions during his lifetime, because there's a lot of things that come up now, and it's like even his best friend Doug Skinner doesn't know the answer, And it's like a Native American friend of ours said, every time someone passes away, it's like a whole library is gone of knowledge.
That's a good
and such.
analogy. I think that's a very good analogy. Is there anything else you want to talk about here with the last 10 or so minutes we have, or have we covered the things that you wanted to speak about?
Well, I could just mention that I have my online magazine that comes out on the first of
Talk
each
about
month.
that.
It's www.apmagazine.info. That's apmagazine.info, and it's called Alternate Perceptions.
Alternate perceptions, yeah.
And we have different articles and interviews and book reviews, and also each issue is archived, so that not only can you check out what's in the current issue, you can also go back to back issues, and read those articles as well. And I try not to dwell on a lot of rehash that's out there. I try to present and articles that deal with new cases and things that probably, well, I know people haven't ever heard of before, and so we've been, as I said, doing that since 1985. Greg Little has been a big part of that and helped me tremendously. And in 1993, he told me that he would like to come on board and help me publish even an upgraded publication. And for a while, we were actually like 56 pages with a color cover, and we had magazine distributors from coast to coast and up into Canada.
Oh.
But it became clear about 2000 that everybody was going to the internet.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
So we got at the time we were like a quarterly publication. Now you can read us monthly, and it's free. So you can't beat that.
And won't you give the internet address again for your publication?
Sure, it's apmagazine.info.
Okay. And that's alternate or alternative perceptions?
Yeah, alternate perceptions.
Okay. So where else can they find both the book that you wrote about John Keel and any other book you've
Well, I've written 3 books to date, and they're all listed on, as well as Greg Little's books, on the menu page of our magazine,
okay,
and they're available from Amazon.
Amazon.
Uh, yeah, I wrote Visitors from Hidden Realms in 2004, and then I wrote On the Edge of Reality in uh, 2009, and then John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing
Right.
Mysteries, July of 2019. That was my most recent contribution there.
And you're on Facebook too. I've seen your Facebook page. So another way
Yeah,
to get a hold of
yeah,
you.
under Brent Raynes, I'm listed
Yeah.
there, and as well as I have an alternate perceptions page on Facebook
Okay.
as well.
Very good.
So there's so
Well, I just would like to thank you for taking your time. I mean, you don't know me from Adam. So the fact that you would take your time to come on and have a conversation, that means a lot. And I think the reason I do what I do, I've been doing this for about 12 years, used to be a teacher,
mhm.
I used to teach sociology. And so there's still a part of me that wants to use this as an educational tool to get people to think about things they haven't thought about before. So I'm very thankful for you to participate in that and appreciate your time. And if you ever want to come back and visit, we'd be more than happy to have you.
Well, Dan, I appreciate it, and I learn this way too. I have my own interview shows that I
Yeah,
do, and I YouTube now, and I get to meet a lot of interesting people, and the
very
beauty of
interesting.
doing this, I use Skype, you use Zoom, but you can connect with people. I recently interviewed an anthropologist over in Wales,
Yeah,
and you get to interview people all over the world.
you do.
Uh, what's really wild is when you interview somebody in Australia and it's another day, but
Well, now interesting that you'd bring that up because I have a couple of opus people assigned to me, and one lives in New Zealand and one lives in
Mhm.
Australia. And it's really tough to work out that time difference given their schedule so that we can do a Zoom meeting. So yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
I know what you're talking about.
yeah. I've done probably about 4. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, maybe I ought to get some info from you on how to do that. I'll send you some information about Opus and a
Great.
couple of contact
Appreciate it.
names. So if you want to look into that, and next time you see Greg Little, say hello from Dan Hall. I really enjoyed having him as a guest. I like his posts on Facebook. And thanks again for being part of the show. We probably won't use the video portion when we edit it. We'll just use the audio portion, and we'll use your picture and maybe put some books to kind of showcase
Okay.
that on our YouTube channel. But I thank you once again.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
Sure. Okay. Take care.
Okay. All right. You too. Thank you.